90-Pound Rucksack. Story of the 10th Mountain Division and the dawn of outdoor recreation in America.
Hi, I'm Maurice Isserman, and I teach history at Hamilton College in upstate New York. And I am the author of a number of books on the history of mountaineering, including Winter Army, which is a history of the 10th Mountain Division.
Thank you. And so what's so intriguing about some of the things that you've written is your highlighting of the fact of the American Alpine Club's involvement in the genesis and evolution of the 10th Mountain Division. And this seems to be a narrative thread that others have missed in the telling of the story. I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what you found in your research regarding the American Alpine Club's role.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, first thing, I'm not a military historian by training, and I haven't written any other military history. But in writing about the history of mountaineering in general, and American mountaineering in particular, I kept running into the 10th Mountain Division. I wrote a book called Fallen Giants, A History of Himalayan Mountaineering, and I ran into a number of characters like Bob Bates and Ad Carter, associated with the American Alpine Club, who in the 1930s were pioneers in American ventures into the Himalaya, and they both had connections with the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. And again, writing Continental Divide, my history of American mountaineering, wherever Americans went to climb from the beginning of settlement in North America down to the present. In the 1930s and early 40s, again, I ran into lots of ways in which climbers coming out of the American Alpine Club, the Sierra Club, and a few other places, contributed to the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. So I sort of backed into writing this military history about the first American Alpine fighting unit.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were researching for Fallen Giants, I see that you gave credit to H. Adams Carter and Bob Bates and their lobbying efforts with the U.S. Army to create a division. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the standard story, and it's not untrue, is that a guy named Charles Minot Dole, or Minnie Dole, who was a founder of the National Ski Patrol and an avid and very good amateur skier, along with several friends of his, came up with the idea for the 10th Mountain Division after a long day's skiing one day in February of 1940. That is before the United States was a belligerent, but when the Second World War was already about 6 months old. And they were thinking that, eventually the United States was going to get involved. And given that potential enemies like Germany and Italy had a well-developed tradition of mountain troops, given that their national borders fell on the Alps, the United States should think about doing the same. And the National Ski Patrol was undoubtedly very important creation of 10th Mountain Division, so much so that they were appointed by the Army, the first time a civilian agency was given this responsibility for recruiting the first 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 troops who came as recruits to what became the U.S. Army 10th Mountain Division. But there was another side of that story, and that involved the climbing community, which at the time, in the 1930s, was quite small, centered in the American Alpine Club, in the rock climbing section of the Sierra Club, in some corners of the Appalachian Mountain Club, and a few other climbing groups, a few university groups. And out of that community came some pretty vital contributions to, first of all, the idea of creating mountain troops, but secondly, to figuring out what they were going to need to do the job in terms of gear, in terms of clothing, in terms of technique.
Hmm. And can you talk to the actual inception? So we've got this moment that Bob Bates documents in his memoir about being in Switzerland with Ad Carter and observing the maneuvers of the Swiss mountain troops and saying, we need to talk to somebody in the War Department about this.
Yeah, this is late summer of 1939, and the Second World War begins on September 1st. And they're in Switzerland. And Switzerland, of course, another place with a long tradition of mountain troops. And they managed to remain neutral in the Second World War. But they're there when the Swiss Army is on maneuvers, and they observe them as they're doing their own climbing. And kind of look at each other and think, if a war is coming, and if the United States gets involved in this war, we're going to need some of those ourselves. And if the chronology is not entirely clear about when they began to share this idea, but sometime 1939, 1940, they do begin to reach out to influential people, some of them in the War Department, to bring this idea to the fore. And their efforts are parallel to, and at the same time as, those that Minnie Dole and his friends from the National Ski Patrol skiing community are making similar suggestions. But to give one example of how they made their own unique contribution, another thing they observed when they were climbing in Switzerland were these molded soles on climbing boots that gripped rock and ice far more effectively than the hobnails nailed into the climbing boots of the era, which was a standard gear for European climbers and American climbers up to that point. And those are what we know as Vibram soles, and an Italian inventor. And they would be instrumental, Bates, I think in particular, in tracking down a pair of boots that an American climber had and bringing them to the attention of the Quartermaster Corps of the U.S. Army, so that American 10th Mountain guys would be getting boots with those soles later on during the war.
Mm-hmm. And so in this critical period, when the 10th Mountain Division was not yet anything other than a twinkle in a few folks' eyes,
right?
What role did these American Alpine Club members like H. Adams Carter and Bob Bates have in opening the military's eyes to the need for these mountain troops?
Well, again, by pulling strings, Bob Bates climbed with James Conant, who was president of Harvard University, and filled his ears with his ideas. And Conant would become very important in the defense establishment, defense scientific establishment during the war. And Conant would pass those ideas along. One of Ad Carter's signature contributions was he was well-versed in European languages, spoke French and German, I think Italian, and he went through the journals published by the various alpine clubs in Europe and translated many of the articles that had to do with cold weather survival and winter mountaineering techniques, so making those available to American military planners, which again helped in development of cold weather gear and also cold weather survival technique.
So how would you characterize the genesis of the 10th Mountain Division? We've got the American Alpine Club as a player. We have Minnie Dole and National Ski Patrol Service.
Right.
We have the Army as well, Lieutenant Colonels Hurtis and Walker.
Well, Minnie Dole writes directly to Franklin Roosevelt, who passes his concerns along in the spring, summer of 1940 to the Army. And the Army does begin a limited program of training troops in the following winter. So we're now up to the winter of 40-41. They begin to train several thousand troops in cross-country ski techniques and ski patrolling at high altitude, those kinds of things. But the U.S. Army is a warm weather outfit. It's never had mountain troops. It's never fought a battle at high altitude. Most of its bases are in the South or in the Caribbean or in Hawaii or places like that. And it's very hard, generals are always prepared to fight the last war, and there wasn't a last war they could refer to that involved mountain troops. There were some soldiers stationed in Alaska, but the last time the U.S. Army put together a handbook on cold weather operations was, I think, 1914 or so. So all of this was hopelessly outdated. And it's really only in the summer and fall of 1941 that the Army gets serious about this. It sees how poorly Italian troops did fighting in the mountains in their invasion of Greece. They had to be bailed out by the Germans. By the fall and winter of 1941, of course, there's the experience of the Germans invading the Soviet Union. The real model here, though, is a war that we tend to forget about, which took place in 1939-1940, when the Soviet Union sent its Red Army into Finland to win territorial concessions in order to increase the strength of its northern border, particularly in regards to the city of Leningrad. And the much smaller Finnish army held them off for 6 months because they had specially trained ski troops. They weren't mountain troops. They weren't fighting in the mountains, but they were fighting in cold weather terrain. And the Red Army was restricted to the roads. They had their tanks and their trucks and their troops, but they would be on the roads. And these Finnish ski troops would come ambushing them, coming out of the woods in the snow, wreaking havoc on those slow-moving columns, and then disappearing back into snow. And the Minnie Dole, in particular, and his friends were very taken by that example. And at this point, they were still thinking in terms of hemispheric defense. That is to say, by the spring of 1940, France will have fallen. Hitler will be master of Europe all the way to the English Channel. And Britain was in danger of invasion. Well, what happens if Britain is invaded and conquered? Which was a real possibility in the summer and fall of 1940. What happens then if the Germans cross the Atlantic and invade Canada? I mean, that's not, in retrospect, a very realistic prospect, but they were thinking about that. And so they thought, well, what happens then if the Germans in Canada come down the Champlain Valley? What would the U.S. Army, how would they respond in cold weather techniques without mountain troops? We really got to get going in developing a deterrent force or a force able to repel just that kind of invasion. And so the Army, I don't know what they thought about that particular scenario, but finally, in the fall of 1941, in November of 1941, creates the initial unit that will grow into the 10th Mountain Division, the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, as it's called, which is based at Fort Lewis in Washington State, and which will be training that winter, 1941-42, on Mount Rainier. And then later, the Army will develop its own base separate base in the Colorado Rockies at Camp Hale, which is where the other two regiments, the 86th and 85th Mountain Infantry, will be mobilized, and together those three regiments will constitute the U.S. Army 10th Mountain Division.
What can you tell us about Henry Stimson?
Well, Henry Stimson was a climber. He was a member of the American Alpine Club, and so he was a natural person to reach out to. He wasn't the main figure in the creation of the 10th Mountain Division. That was Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff, and people he delegated the task to. But he was certainly a useful contact to get the idea thought of as something other than just a crackpot. All kinds of people were coming with all kinds of suggestions, and from civilians, and the Army tended to dismiss them out of hand. Rifles that could shoot around corners with curved barrels and things like that. And at first they tended to regard the idea for mountain troops similar. Mountain division is very different than what they called a flatland division. Flatland division is bigger. It has many more trucks and jeeps and heavier artillery and heavier machine guns. If you're talking about mountain troops, they can't take their trucks up into the mountains. They have to transport their gear, their food, their supplies, their ammunition by mules often. And the Army thought, mules? Who wants to have a division built around mules? And 30 caliber machine guns instead of 50 caliber machine guns, and 75 caliber artillery as opposed to 150 caliber, and so on and so forth. So they were not very sympathetic. Finally, they agreed to create this division, and they keep it in the United States. It's formed in December 1941. It doesn't get to Italy to the fighting until December 1944, January 1945. So even when they have this extremely well-trained, well-equipped, eager division, men who really want to get into the fighting and see that fighting is going on in places like Italy, which is nothing but mountains, the Army delays and delays and delays until finally the U.S. Army military commander of the Allied forces in Italy, Mark Clark, decides in the fall of 1944 that, well, yes, we could use some mountain troops here. And they bring them in for the last 4 or 5 months of fighting, at which time they play an absolutely crucial role in breaking out of the northern Apennine Mountains and breaking into the open flatland where you can use the U.S. Army to its greatest effect with its tanks and its air cover. And even then, they remain in the vanguard all the way from the breakout in the beginning of April to the final surrender of German forces in Italy on May the 2nd, 1945.
In your research, what have you found that opened General Marshall's mind to the possibility of the need for troops?
Well, Marshall was a smart guy. He often is overlooked. I mean, we tend to look at the generals who were there in the fighting. We look at Eisenhower, of course, who commanded Allied expeditionary forces from North Africa and into the invasions of Europe itself. We know about people like General Patton and his role as an aggressive commander, but we forget about the guy who recognized the talents of both Eisenhower and Patton when they were lowly colonels at the start of the war, and cleared out a lot of the deadwood, a lot of the generals who were getting long in tooth and hadn't had a new idea since 1917, and made way for talent. I mean, Marshall oversees the expansion of the United States Army from under 200,000 men in 1939 when it's the 17th largest army in the world. Romania is the 16th largest. Romania has a larger army than the United States, expands it to what is it at its heights? 6 or 7 or 8 million men, who are the best equipped army in the world. He oversees the creation, not just of mountain troops, but of armored divisions. The United States didn't have any armored divisions. Airborne divisions, it didn't have any airborne divisions. It had 2 cavalry divisions at the start of the war, neither of which proved very useful, one of which was very soon disbanded. Cavalry divisions continue to exist, but they don't bring the horses to Europe. So Marshall is an absolutely key figure in the American mobilization for war, and he, had the foresight to see that what these crazy civilian skiers and climbers were saying actually made some sense. He was open to that.